So, yeah, good afternoon. Since we have people, following the conference on the web, we should start. So this is the second part of this scientific conference of MICROPROD. So this is the paper selected for the work package number 3, which is about innovation, digitalization, and productivity. And the presenter is Valérie Smets. So Valérie, the floor is yours for 20 minutes.
Okay, I will try to do my best. Okay, so this is a project John with Jinting Fan from Penn State University, and also Unili from University of Maryland. So I apologize, my slides, the screen is a bit small, my slides are going to be a bit tiny, but I will try to, to share what's on them, or at least to convince them. No, I can tell you anything, kind of verify it, right? Okay, so what's going to be the motivation for this project is basically when we think about globalization, we know that one of the facts when we think about globalization is that made it easier for firms to source inputs internationally, right? This is something that we know. And usually in the literature, in the academic literature, we find that there are quite large gains of doing that for firms, right? When they're going to source inputs internationally, it's usually associated to higher firm performance. Now, when we think about this literature, the focus has been almost exclusively on production intermediate input, right? So we think about the firm is going to start, offshoring production in a different country, and this is what the literature has been focusing on. And when you look at, what kind of inputs can be sourced internationally, of course there are production inputs, but there are also another type of inputs like services that have been studied as much, and especially R&D services, which has been our focus of interest in this research project, also be rising over time. So basically what we're going to study here is trade liberalization and the rises in sourcing foreign input, but we're going to think about R&D in this case. Now, we're going to think, so one of the questions we want to answer here or focus on is going to be, is there an interdependence? Is there some kind of complementarity or maybe substitutability between different R&D sourcing strategies? And whatever we're going to observe there, does it have an impact on our own firm level productivity, but also aggregate productivity? And one of the big difference of looking at, let's say, R&D inputs as opposed to looking at production inputs is from the literature we know that R&D usually is going to bring long-term dynamic gains to firm performance, while production inputs usually have short-term impact on productivity. So when we're going to think about policy, policy experiments and long-term gains, R&D have a possibility to have larger contribution to aggregate productivity than production inputs. So this is just to show you an idea what we're going to have in mind here and when I think about R&D inputs and foreign R&D inputs. So on the left-hand side, at least I hope you can see the graph, what we have is the share of immigrants among researchers. So this paper is going to be focusing on Denmark. And what you can see is that the share of immigrants among researchers has been rising over time. So you have this increasing line here. So that's going to be one of the inputs, R&D inputs, foreign R&D inputs we have in mind is those immigrant researchers. And the second one is the offshore share of R&D expenditure. And again, it's a little bit flat at the beginning, but you can see also that over time, firms are using more and more R&D or offshoring R&D than they used to do before, right? So those two graphs is just to show you, in the case I'm going to look at Denmark, we see more firms relying on immigrant researchers, and we see more firms doing offshore R&D. This is not only the case for Denmark. You would look at OECD numbers, you will see a very similar picture of this story. So what we're going to do in this paper, we're going to study the firm's decision of using these foreign R&D inputs and implication for firm performance and firm productivity. We're going to document two main facts, a little bit more, but I'm going to focus on those two. The first one is going to be that the use of these foreign R&D inputs, and especially diverse, the more different type of foreign R&D inputs you're going to use, the higher the firm efficiency is going to be, and the higher also aggregate performance. And the second one I'm going to show you is that when firms are going to recruit immigrants, it's going to reduce the barriers that they face in sourcing R&D services from abroad. So in a nutshell, what it means is that if I'm a firm and I'm recruiting immigrant researchers, it's going to help me to offshore R&D abroad. Then we're going to have a quantitative dynamic firm dynamics model here, in which R&D can be made using a different kind of combination of inputs. I will just try to tell you the intuition of what we're going to have here. But what we're going to have in this model, we're going to have basically two ways of thinking about how firms can combine these different R&D inputs. One is going to be what we're going to call this love for variety of ideas. So if you're from international trade, we have this love for variety, which is the idea that if you like ice cream, if you eat many different types of taste of ice cream, it's going to make you more happy. It's basically going to be the same idea here, is that we're going to have, based on our facts, that if firms rely on different type of foreign R&D inputs or different R&D inputs, it's just going to, make them more efficient. And then we're going to have this information channel, which is also something that people studying immigration have been finding, is the idea that immigrant researcher in this specific case may drive down the source of sourcing R&D. And then this model is going to be very useful because it's going to allow us to think about a world that don't exist, so to do some kind of policy experiment and see what would happen, if you have an R&D subsidy policy, or if you decrease, let's say if you reduce barrier to immigration in a country, what would happen through R&D and then through firm and aggregate productivity. So main results we're going to have, because I'm pretty sure I'm never going to reach the end of my slides. In terms of the love for variety of ideas, so we're going to have in the paper, I'm not going to present that here, but some structural estimation of what exactly, in terms of number, the effect of having this diversified R&D input. And what you find that when you have diversified foreign R&D inputs is basically giving you, at the firm level, between 2 and 2.5 increase in productivity gains, okay? And what we also find, and I think maybe it's easier to look at my third bullet point here, is that when we do some experiments later on, and we try, to assume that firms don't especially have benefits of doing different type of R&D. If we shut that down in a very sad world, with respect to the world in which we are here in the model, then we miss that basically this diversity of ideas account for 80% of the return to R&D, meaning it's really important to have this diversified R&D input. In terms of the information channel, what we show is that when firms have immigrants, it's basically going to drop the cost of offshoring R&D abroad by around 20%. So there is definitely a benefit to have immigrant workers to offshore R&D. And we also show in some policy experiment that the fact that having immigrants is going to help you to offshore R&D in another country is going to amplify the effect of policies like immigration, easing immigration in a country of high-skilled workers, or easing like offshoring. That is going to basically amplify the effect. So if we don't have those effects, we'll miss a big part of the impact of those policies. So literature, I'm going to skip that because we don't have time. So we're going to have some data. I'm also not going to spend too much time on the data. The only thing I'm going to tell you is from Denmark. Then data from Denmark are pretty awesome. And what we're going to be having for us that's important is the way we're going to identify offshoring R&D is going to come from an R&D survey where they explicitly state that they offshore R&D. So there's going to be a direct measure in our data. And also in terms of how we identify immigrants, researchers, we're going to have information about every workers in those firms we have in the R&D survey. And we know if those workers are doing R&D tasks, and we know if they're immigrants, okay? So we're going to just identify things that way. Then we're going to have a lot of other data we're going to use to look at firm productivity and things like that. But I think for the time I have, I'm just not going to focus too much. There is a lot in the paper if you're interested. So we're going to have 3 facts, and I mentioned already some of them, but I'm like the hammer strategy that I repeat the same thing 20 times, so I'm sure you get it, that are basically going to help us to build a model. So the model is basically telling us a story, right? And you're going to trust my story or you're not going to believe into it. But that's why we're going to use some facts to try to convince you that the assumption we make in the model make sense, or at least as close to the data as possible. So the first thing we're going to observe is that when you look at firms, and when you condition on the current productivity and total R&D expenditure, we find that if they use foreign R&D inputs, they're more productive. So we're just going to compare firms with each other, and the one that are basically going to do not only R&D with, Danish guys, they're also going to have, Chinese workers or Iranian workers or whatsoever, they're going to be more productive. And if they add at the top of that offshoring, they're also going to be more productive. Now, this is not terribly surprising, but it's already telling you something about complementarity versus substitution patterns. Because if they were complete substitution, they will never do all of them, right? It would be better to invest only in one type of input. So it's already giving you an idea that there may be this love for variety of ideas that firms like. It could be a selection effect, but that firms like to have this different type of R&D input because it leads them to be more productive. The second thing we're going to have, or we're going to find, is that firms doing R&D with foreign R&D inputs are more productive on average, and especially R&D status and R&D modes are persistent. So it means that when firms decide to do a specific type of R&D mode, let's say I have immigrants and I have Danish guys, they have a tendency to stick to it. And what it's going to tell us for the model is that we're going to load a lot of things in a model on fixed and sunk cost of doing R&D activities, so that based on the data, so that the reason, some firms are going to do R&D in certain way and not every firm is because they're going to be some cost, and not every firm will be able to afford those costs. Now, the last thing we document is that firms with immigrant researchers are more likely to offshore R&D. Now, we document those facts using very different ways, but I think one of the most convincing ways for me is that we use also country-level variation. So if you have some Chinese researchers that end up in your firm in Denmark, the probability in the future you offshore R&D to China is going to increase. Okay, so there is really this idea that those immigrant researchers are going to bring some knowledge about the foreign country, so it's easier for them to offshore them. So yeah, and just again, I'm going to probably skip a lot of slides, but the mechanism at play, the model how it's going to work, is that we're going to have firms, and firms, they're going to do R&D, they're going to decide to do R&D or not, and they would like to hire these foreign R&D inputs, right? Either the immigrants, or they would like to do offshoring R&D, because they know it's going to give them a higher productivity boost. So in a perfect world, if there were no frictions or constraint, everybody will do all these R&D inputs because it leads them to become better. The problem is not every firm can do it because there is a cost of doing this, right? And not all the firm can afford the cost. So that's why there's going to be a selection here. Is only a subset of firms will be able to do 2 R&D strategy, or 3, meaning having immigrants and offshoring R&D. Now, we have this idea that those immigrants can help you to offshore R&D abroad. So in the model, we're also going to have that such cost can be mitigated for firms having immigrants because of this information channel. And so what we're going to have is that this information channel is making it easier for firms to take advantage of this love for variety of ideas. So think about these 2 mechanisms. They're not really substitute, they're just reinforcing each other. Okay, I have 8 minutes and a half left. Good. So I'm going to have some model with some equations, some Greek letters, and they're awesome. I'm just going to try to explain to you how it works very quickly, so you get the intuition how the model is going to be built. So we're going to have firms that, they make this what we call static production decisions, so they need to how much output they're going to produce here. What's going to be important for us is we're interested in this project about productivity, right? So that's going to be a focus of analysis here. And the way we're going to think about firm productivity is not really new. The literature has been doing that before. But we're going to think about omega. This is productivity. So if I'm a firm, I have a tendency to carry on my productivity with me. So if I was good yesterday, I'm going to be good today. And how do I become better than yesterday in my model is going to depend on the R&D I'm doing, right? So if I do more R&D, I can improve my productivity in the future. This is why we usually think about R&D as a dynamic input. It can lead to, permanent productivity growth over time. So there is nothing really fancy about this. This is just following the literature. What's going to be new is we're going to try to open up this R&D and we're going to open it up in a way that is going to be a function of 3 inputs. The Danish guys, the domestic workers, the R&D I do in Denmark with Danish workers, and the 2 type of foreign R&D inputs I was talking about. Basically here, this is going to be the immigrant researchers, and here, this is going to be offshoring I can do abroad. And then they're going to be this data here, which is basically going to reflect whether those 3 type of R&D are more complements or more substitute with each other. Like, should I focus all my attention in one type of R&D, or should I just diversify to lead to more returns to productivity? And so, yeah, in the model, we're basically going to have the decision for firms dynamically whether they're going to do R&D. Some of them are going to decide it's too expensive for me, I'm just never going to do it. And then what type of R&D, you know, do I want 1 of them, 2 of them, 3 of them, and in which type of combination? So then we also have an optimization problem, and the only thing I want to focus on is basically the next slide. So what's also going to be important, I told you not every firm can do R&D, and not every firm can do the full set of R&D input choices. So the way it's going to work in the model is we're going to have a fixed cost to do R&D each period and to do each type of R&D. And we're also going to have what we call those sunk costs. So like, if you used to do a certain type of R&D and I'm like, hey, I really want to hire these Chinese immigrant, you know, researchers because I think they're awesome, and you want to turn to that strategy, then you know you're going to have some kind of fixed cost to activate, to introduce or adopt this new type of R&D input. And then the way we're going to load this information channel I was telling you about in the model is that we're going to allow the possibility, we're not going to impose it, we're going to let the model, you know, check it for us, but we're going to allow the possibility that if you have immigrants, researchers, then your cost of switching and adopting offshore R&D is going to be lower. And again, this is, you know, whether this is important or not, and also whether this kind of elasticity of substitution is more complement or substitute, we're just going to estimate that model on the data. So we're not going to take any constraint on that. This is going to be very flexible. And so what's also important to understand for the model is why firm would change. It's a dynamic model, right? So it's about firms, you know, making decision and maybe changing decision over time. So in the model, this decision to change your R&D kind of organization will depend on two things. It will depend on the cost, and we also depend on some kind of preference, just shocks, like this year I just feel like I'm going to use immigrants or something like that. Yeah, 3 minutes, hey, yeah. Okay, so we have a model strategy. I'm not going to talk about too much. It's kind of very technical, but for people who like those things, it's kind of cute. I'm just going to focus more on like the counterfactual, which I think for policy is a little bit more important. So we take a model and we do basically some kind of experiment in the following way. So the first thing we want to try to understand is what exactly is the role of this information channel. How important are those immigrants to offshore R&D? And also, how important is this love for variety of ideas? The fact that, you know, those firms like, if they can, to do everything, all these kind of different R&D strategies. And just gonna focus what's written here, forget about the table here. So what we find is that, of course, if you shut down the love for variety, so firms don't like doing many cases, or you shut down the information channel, those immigrants are completely useless. Like me in Denmark, a Belgian is totally useless. Then we find that, you know, less firms do R&D. This is not very surprising. What's more interesting is that if we build a world that doesn't exist, but if you build a world where we shut down the return to R&Ds, and firms are forced to only have domestic workers, you can only reap 20% of the full return to R&D. So you're basically missing 80% if you're forced to only work with domestic workers, which is kind of a large effect. The second thing we look at is some kind of policies. So now we're like, okay, what happens if a country wants to design immigration and offshoring policy, and the way we do this is subjectively syncing up a policy when we decrease in the model 50% of the cost. Okay, so either we decrease 50% of the cost for firms to have those immigrants, or 50% of the cost for firms who want to do offshore R&D. And then what's interesting is, of course, when you do those policy, firms do more R&D. They especially do more R&D with immigrants and offshoring. This is not terribly surprising. But what's interesting is that, you know, this information channel, the fact that these immigrants help you offshore because they decrease your cost. So if you assume that this is not the case, and you shut down this kind of information channel, then you will lose productivity between 30 and 50%. Which means that when you're going to be a country and you're going to think about policies, let's say, I want to attract more R&D workers in my country, if you don't take this mechanism into account, you're going to miss nearly 50% of the possible conclusion or economic consequences on aggregate productivity from this policy. So we also have some R&D subsidies, which is basically telling you the same, is that we're going to underestimate the effect of R&D subsidies if we don't take this mechanism into account. So just to conclude, we have a paper in which we have some new facts about firms' use of immigrant researchers and offshore R&D. We have a model we build on this. And then I think those are the 5 take of this project. The 2 foreign R&D inputs play a complementary role in R&D, so they're not substitute. And without access to those, R&D participation and also the aggregate return to R&D would decrease substantially. Policies that change the cost of immigrants have a significant impact on firm offshore R&D decision and vice versa, so this is the complementarity I was talking about, but it's also related in terms of policy implication. Omitting these inputs would lead researchers to underestimate the effect of R&D subsidy on aggregate productivity. And yes, not accounting for interconnection in terms of aggregate productivity will miss the effect by 30 to 50%, suggesting that policy, when we shut down, you know, more restrictive policy, limiting the access of immigrants R&D to come in a country, or trying to create barriers for offshoring R&D, could impediment from productivity or generally aggregate productivity growth.
Thank you very much, Valérie. So it needs an upload because you did it in 21 minutes, which is a performance. Yeah. I have the same information for some reason. And so this is a performance because the paper was rather complex. And so we understood, you know, the argument about the love of variety for ideas. So Maria, that's your turn.
Yes, so thank you very much. I just want to make a few introductory remarks. This is a very rich paper. I mean, so I don't think that I have read it with the appropriate attention because there is a lot of details, in particular in the model and in the counterfactual that is really worth thinking a little bit more about. But I wanted to say a few things about what to make with all of these results, which are, you know, fundamentally they're good results in the sense they're good news. So the paper is telling us that if you were to employ foreign R&D workers, I mean, you call them immigrants in the paper, even in your presentation, but I think you really are talking about the high end of the skill distribution here, right? So we're talking about very skilled workers that are coming in. So I think it's perhaps important to make sure that you are talking about that, not about the whole distribution of skills. Also because, as you said also in the paper, this has got a lot of political implications, the way you sell this. So you are talking about the high skill end of the distribution, and I think that's important. But effectively what you're saying then is that the more you employ foreign skilled people, then that is going to affect positively your productivity contemporaneously, dynamically. But also the other result, which I think is very interesting, is the interaction with the ability of employing foreign people in your firm is going to allow you to tap into R&D sources which are beyond the country. Right? This is the interaction term, which I think is absolutely wonderful. So the diversity of ideas, what you call the love of the variety of ideas, actually works in two ways. It works both by hiring the people in your the foreign people, high-skilled people in your firm, but also by opening up doors to reach out, to research ideas beyond the border. So I think that's a very nice result. And then in the counterfactual, so in the model part, you're telling us what types of policies, in the form of cost primarily, how by manipulating a little bit the cost of the subsidies, you can liberalize the ability of people to come in and therefore benefit the company. So I think that's basically the gist of the paper, I think. That's very important. Now, how do we then, if you wanted to inform policy. What would you take from this paper? I think here it would be, I think maybe a little bit worth our effort to go and look a bit more at the data, because I think it's important to reflect on a number of things that are going on that you might want to make use. First of all, you are estimating, to the extent that you're looking at the performance of the firms in question, and indeed at the graphs you showed, the data skills going up, the research skills going up over the foreigners with high skills coming into Denmark. This happens in a very specific period. This is the period of 2020, 2015, right? The 15 years, the first 15 years of the new millennium. And there is two things that are going on in this period, which might have direct implications for your pool of people you're looking at, and that is there is enlargement in the EU that basically opened up the border of a very big number of countries, a very big labor force that was very mobile. Well, if you think about the countries in the center of Eastern Europe, a lot of very high-skilled workers have now become available to the rest of the EU. And on top of this, in 2008, you had the financial crisis, where you then had the famous brain drain from the southern part of Europe, right? So what I would have liked to have seen is maybe this descriptive statistics table in which you're telling us this increase in figure 1 that you showed. What was the geographical composition of this? Is this simply an EU effect? Or are you also talking about non-EU countries coming into Denmark and therefore contributing in the way that you contribute? Because if it is just the former, then I doubt very much that this is the result of policy. This is pretty much basically the opening up of the borders, and effectively people who left stressed countries in both geographical regions, both the East because it was the beginning of EU enlargement, and from the South because it was the financial crisis where you had a huge brain drain. And countries like Germany, for which we have the numbers, they have benefited tremendously from very high-skilled immigrants coming into the economy. And therefore, I would imagine that there is, at a smaller scale, because Denmark is also a smaller country, you would have a similar benefit in the Scandinavian countries, of which there is some evidence. However, if that is not the case, and that I doubt that it isn't, but if it isn't the case, but you're talking about people coming from outside the EU, then your story on which policy and what kind of sunk costs, what kind of liberalization policies have contributed to this result will, of course, be of great interest, because it will also inform what kind of policies you can do to try and get to this result. So that's that thing. So if I wanted to see something, it would be exactly the geographical. If you just replot the first graph, but this time telling us the country of origin of the countries, because then we will know, oh, it's policy, or it's just the two shocks that to the extent that they are shocks. There are shocks that describe them. Then the other thing I'd like to point out is that there is Europe actually has got exactly the opposite history of migration. The 2015 shock that we saw with the big migration crisis was the first time that we saw people coming into the EU. So the EU, the tradition in the EU is to actually send skills away, not receive them. And if anything, we are, and this is a very big discussion actually in Europe, we are not attracting skills, high skills, the way that the US is. Right, and that's a very big difference between the EU and this. So we attract migration certainly since 2015, contrary to our history, where normally we export skills, but actually we are not certainly not attracting them in the high level, and that of course means that policy needs to come in and look for these parameters in your model that it can manipulate in order to try and achieve this result. Because I think your result is a very interesting one, and actually it is actually giving us evidence to try and promote policies that are going to attract the high skills in Europe. Now, of course, we don't have to attract the Chinese or the Indians in here because we have migration within EU, and that may be just it. But I think the period for which you're doing this is a little bit distorted because it was, if you like, forced migration, in the sense that there was these shifts of power that I'm sure there is, certainly in Central and Eastern Europe, you're now having people come back. And the Southern Europe, the brain drain at least has stopped, right? So, I mean, is this something that you, if you were to sort of wait another 10 years and rewrite the paper, would you still see the same thing? Well, it depends on what the source of your migration was, right? I think that would be an important thing to say. But all in all, I think this is a very interesting paper in terms of what it tells us. And I think it requires a bit more careful reading than the one that I have done. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. So maybe before Valerie tells us whether she will find the same results in 10 years from now. We can grab a couple of questions from the floor. So, Stephen.
So thank you for this very interesting topic and presentation. So if I got it right, your result means that if you source R&D services from abroad, or if you kind of hire foreign workers, you get a higher return on productivity. So I'm wondering what the mechanisms here could be. So the first thing that came to my mind is that you can draw from a bigger market, right? You can draw R&D services from a much bigger worldwide market than just from the Danish market. So you could draw on, I don't know, Indian programmers, German robot experts, whatever. So the question is whether this is a market size story, and you are coming from a very small country now, Denmark. And the question is, should we expect to see the same magnitude of effects for a big country like Germany or the US or China? Or could it be driven by the fact that Denmark has a relatively small population, thereby maybe a relatively small market for R&D services?
Okay, maybe one more question. Yeah.
Maybe I think I related the question, and maybe even the same, if I understood. So in the US, there's a lot of kind of both types of things going on, right? So we bring into the country scientists, right, that want to do science in the US, but we also bring in a lot of immigrants, students that come in, and we train them in the US, and they're foreign and they're immigrant, and then we hire them inside once they're inside. Do you have a sense in your data for what is it? Is it the student that you train here that is highly, that's highly selected, let's say, or is it scientists already trained that we're bringing from outside?
Okay, so I may take benefit of my position to add one more on the list, which is very much related to Stephen's question. So this is about the argument of the love for variety of ideas. So I will somehow challenge this argument, if I may. So what you have in mind is basically this Stiglitz applied to intermediate inputs. So we all agree that this is important. But I'm just wondering whether this is this that you capture in your exercise, or whether you are more looking at something like a better match, so a matching story on the labor market for high-level R&D scientists. And so I will just give an example. So what you are telling us, if I understand correctly, is that if I need 10 more engineers or researchers, I can hire 10 Chinese or 10 Indians or 10 Polish, etc. So if this is just that you fish in a larger pool, and you will find, more accurate, specialists. Now, the variety is not exactly this. The variety is telling you that you should hire one Chinese, one Indian, etc., and one French, etc., in order to reach the 10, in order to have this variety effect. So I would have thought of a more, something like an Erfindal index of, the nationality of immigrants that you have in order to fit this idea of variety. So is it a better match just because you open the doors and, as Stefan said, you fish in a larger pool, especially for a small country, or is it actually variety effects, meaning that you have the largest number of varieties that are hired?
Okay, so thank you so much for all these questions. Super interesting and good questions. I'm going to start answering your questions. So we in fact looked a little bit at this. We didn't, I did it a long time ago, but I don't remember the results, but we have in the appendix some information about the origin of country of those immigrants. And initially I was like you, it's only going to be like Polish and that's it. Like, everybody from Eastern Europe, because we're right in the middle of it. But what's interesting is that we still have a lot of variation. Also because like in Denmark, there were some refugee-heavy policies, so that we also have a lot of high-skilled people coming from Iran, from Iraq, and those countries. So it doesn't seem to be entirely driven by immigrants coming from, like, say, it's Eastern Europe, or going from the South countries. We have like Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and Germany, and also non-EU countries in the top 10 of these origin countries of those immigrants. So I don't think this is only like identifying this. But I agree with you that we could do a better job to document a little bit, like breaking down between the different type of origin countries for those immigrants. In terms of, so what about it happen in 10 years? Well, I don't really know. I agree that there are different policies in the US versus Europe. I think we can still learn. I wouldn't take, although everything I say too seriously, right? I mean, those are quantitative papers. You have to be a bit careful here. But I still think you can learn a lot by understanding, like, or at least having evidence that there seem to be benefits of having multiple R&D input that I think are not exclusively due to the two mechanisms you were talking about. To go back to market size effect on productivity. So first, in everything we do, we always take into account the size of the firm, so that will be taken care of. Also, didn't mention, but the R&D survey is sampling mostly large firms in Denmark. And in fact, I would be worried about the other effect. I would be worried that what we find in our paper is driven by these very large Danish firms, which are #1 globally on their own market. So in fact, it would be more the other way around. I would be a little bit worried, like, you know, companies like Vestas with the windmill, or Novo Nordisk, or Lego, all these kind of firms that would be basically dominating our sample. So I definitely don't think this is due to the fact that Denmark as a small market, especially because those large firms are also exporting most of what they make abroad. The Danish market is definitely not the final, most of the final product market for those firms. Now, in terms of your question, Javier, we look at this. So we look at whether immigrants are coming and didn't study in Denmark, or whether they would have been studying in Denmark, because then if you like, I don't know, a Chinese who studied in Denmark, maybe you look like a Chinese, you look like a Dane, you don't look like a Chinese anymore in terms of this diversification of ideas. We restrict our sample to only look at those R&D workers, immigrants who came after the education, and we find even stronger effect. So this is not really what's driving our story. In terms of the love for variety of ideas, whether it could be a matching story, so the way we identify the return to productivity is in respect to a law of motion. So it's basically productivity today conditioned on your past productivity, and then those different inputs. So if this was a matching between, let's say, a specific type of R&D input and the firm, by conditioning on past productivity, at least we're going to remove this. No, it's true that you discuss about having, like, is it having more R&D guys or just having R&D guys? So in everything I do here, we use the extensive margin. We try a little bit the intensive margin, which would go more into your direction, and we couldn't find anything going on. So it seems to be mostly the extensive margin, which responds like more doing these different type of modes than going more inside one mode. But yeah, thank you everybody for your questions.
Thank you very much. So I think we are perfectly on time. And so I'm still sharing, or I must pass the torch, no? Okay, so Stefan, you are the last, obstacle before the next coffee break. And so this presentation belongs to the work package number 4 about factor relocation and allocative efficiency. Stefan gonna present the paper, and the discussion will be introduced by Javier. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Renel. Good afternoon again from my side. So my name is Steffen Müller. I'm going to present the paper Robots, Firms and Workforce Composition in Germany, which is joint work with Li Shundeng, who is assistant professor in Singapore, Jens Stegmaier, who is a postdoc at the Institute for Employment Research in Nuremberg, and Verena Plümpe, who is my PhD student here with me and who will present the second part of the paper.
Yeah, this paper, in this paper we are asking what happens at the establishment level to employment and workforce composition before, at, and after first time adopting a robot in the firm. We do that in an event study framework, so it's not a causal study, it's not about a causal identification of the robot effect. It's describing what happens at the firm level around robot adoption. And the big strength of the paper is the novel data that we are able to use here. So we have data on robot use at the establishment level. We are able to merge this data with social security records of workers. So we're able to look at what happens by occupation, what happens by worker age, and also kind of interesting, this data is for one of the for the German manufacturing sector, which is a very important manufacturing sector worldwide. Okay, so why should we care about robots? First of all, well, as you might know, robots are currently quite quickly introduced into many industrial sectors and more replace human labor in an increasing number of tasks. This is due to the fact that we see a lot of robotic innovations in recent years. So computers are much more powerful now. Robots are now equipped with advanced sensors, a lot of these things. At the same time, we see that robot prices are declining. So there are some studies showing that since 1990s, the real price for robots decreased by about 50%. And as a result of this, of course, we see a strong increase in robot installation and robot demand worldwide. So the recent forecasts of the International Federation of Robotics for 2024 is that robot installation will double relative to 2015, just a 10-year or 9-year time window. Of course, COVID-19, distancing, social distancing, infection risk, and so forth might further increase the demand for robotics. We know quite a bit about the total effect of robots on employment, and I will come back to this in a minute. But we believe that it's equally important to understand which types of workers are likely substitutes or complements to robots. Just to give you one example, if we believe that robots replace young, unskilled workers, then this might be relatively good news for aging economies. If in turn robots are complements to young and increasingly scarce labor, that's bad news for aging economies. So we would really like to understand which type of workers are complements or substitutes to robots. Well, economic theory, very briefly, Acemoglu-Restrepo in the 2018 work established a new framework for how to understand the effect of robots on employment. We know from later work of Acemoglu-Restrepo that robots should substitute for scarce manual labor in their work. It's middle-aged and younger manual workers. And on the empirical side, we have two strands of the literature. One that's a little bit older, that's based on the sector-level data from the International Federation of Robotics. And here we see mixed results on employment. So Gratz-Michaels, which is one of the first studies, or maybe the first study, find more or less a neutral effect on employment, maybe some negative effects for low-skilled workers. Acemoglu-Restrepo on a commuting zone study find negative effects for American workers, and Dowd and co-authors for Germany find, well, a more or less zero effect on aggregate, so a negative effect for manufacturing workers that is compensated by the service sector. That's kind of interesting, of course, but from this aggregate data, we can't learn much about, well, how these effects actually materialize, whether they are heterogeneous across firms or not. So for instance, we don't know whether these effects are actually driven by firms that adopt robots or by the control group, right? So these kind of basic questions you cannot uncover if you don't use microdata. And for that reason, there's an emerging literature based on firm-level data. And they typically show positive cross-employment effects for robot adopters at the level of individual firms or establishments. But, well, the data that those studies are able to use is not beyond doubt, let's put it that way. So in many cases, those studies use robot import data. So they have data on robot purchases from abroad, which is not the same as having data on whether robots are actually used in the firm, because many robots are just imported and then they are reselling robots to other firms. There are exceptions. Koch et al. Use robot use, for instance, for Spain. What is our contribution? So this is the first micro-level study for Germany, as I mentioned before. We are able to link this plant-level data with, which is direct data on robot use at the plant level, with worker-level data from Social Security records, and also to task data, whereas the task data is merged via a statistical link. The Social Security data is directly merged without any, via plant identifiers. And so with this data, we are first analyzing workforce composition effects with respect to occupation and age and the interaction of occupation and age. So for instance, whether it's young, unskilled workers or old managers and so forth. Let me skip the policy relevance. I think it's relatively clear. If there's a displacement effect, for instance, you would like to know as a policymaker whether there is, for instance, any regional bunching of job displacements to be expected. And if you are an educational policymaker, you would like to know more about which educational policies might be appropriate when robots come up, in particular in aging societies. So we managed to introduce a battery of new questions to the IAB establishment panel, which is a large establishment survey for Germany that is in operation since almost 30 years. It's representative for the German economy. And the main question that we are using today is the question on how many robots a firm actually used during the last 5 years, in our case from 2014 to 2018. Just a word on the robot question. So before we introduced this question, of course, we contacted the IFR, we contacted the German kind of employer federation, that organization that has all these firms in it, to really understand whether firms understand the question. This survey is also pre-tested, of course, so we really make sure that firms do not report any other automation technologies that are non-robots here. So that's really a thoroughly tested survey question. And the good news is that firms do understand what the robot is compared to what other automation machinery is. So this question gives us 4 robot adoption events, 2015, 16, 17, and 18. And as we will run an event study, we now have to bring this data on kind of a common time scale. So we proceed the following way. We randomize the control group into 4 random groups. Control group firms are firms that don't use robots and never install robots during our time window. And then we assign those random groups to the 4 adoption events that we have. So every adoption wave has its own randomized control group. And then we stack those 4 years on the same relative time dimension. So we're able to analyze our question in an event study framework in relative time, which is, by the way, circumventing most of, essentially all the issues that have been brought forward over the last years against those type of difference in difference event study events with leads and lags. Once we have done this, we merge this with plant level employment data from the establishment history panel. That's the social security data that I mentioned. And we also merge it to task information from the Bauer employment survey, which is a survey that has been used in other research on task contents and occupations before. And that's the point in time where Rehna takes over.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, hi everyone. I will continue with the descriptive statistics for our sample that we run the analysis on. So as you can see here, you see the mean outcome variables for the treatment and control group. And I just want to mention some major characteristics that we can identify for these groups. So what we see here is that the robot adapters and non-robot users, they mainly differ in terms of firm size, as robot adapters are significantly larger. Also, we see that the worker turnover for robot adapters is significantly higher or substantially higher than for the control group sample. And we see also some, when we split our outcome variables by, so the employment numbers by occupational shares, so by different occupational groups, we can also identify here some differences between the two groups. For example, robot users, robot adapters have a higher share of simple manual employees, while the control group has a larger share of qualified manual labor. Also important for our analysis later on is that our treatment and control do not differ by, or not structurally differ by their age shares and employment composition in the base year. Also, I want to comment on some features of the occupational task composition, so actually by occupation and age. What we look at here is the replaceability of tasks. This is based on the Bauer employment survey data from 2012. And what we're interested here is in the question, how large is the share of potentially replaceable tasks by robots in each of these groups? And what we can see is also what we have in the model part of our paper, that there are certain occupations, especially the simple manual occupations, that have almost half of their tasks on average is replaceable by robots, and that for other groups such as technicians, engineers, or managers, which are also in the literature rather described as complements of robots, this share is only around 20%. So there's a significant difference again, but also, as you can see on the very right column, this difference does not persist according to age group compositions. This is our event study design formalized. Yes, as Stefan already described the main idea. We have our outcome variables of interest in relative time setting, and we regress on the plant level. And just let me comment here on the overall setting. So, of course, the decision to adopt robots is connected to local labor market conditions. So this means that our OLS regressions would show pro-cyclical effects of robot adoption, meaning that we cannot claim causality here, but as you will see in a second, we can still show some very interesting differential trends for our robot adopters and non-adopters, even though we cannot claim causality at this point. So these are the main results regarding from our event study analysis. So what we can see here is that for the in the year of adoption, so period T, and in the T+1 period, we see a significant increase in overall employment for our treatment group of robot adopters, which is around 6% compared to the pre-period to the base year of T-3. And also in line with this are the results for hirings and separations. For both we see a significantly higher turnover or overall turnover for our treatment group. And it also lines up that hirings are significantly larger than separations, leading to this overall employment increase. These are the workforce composition results by occupation. Here I just plotted the treatment effects that are estimated. And what we can see is, again, something we would expect from the literature and also which is in line with our model. And what we see is that employment for occupational groups that are rather complements to robots, namely technicians and engineers or managers, and to some extent also qualified manual employees, that there we see again a significant increase in employment. And also, by the way, even for simple manual labor, we see the effect is in T and T+1 not significantly different from 0, so it's not significant. Still, this could be in line with our model, as this group at least does not gain or gain least from the robot adoption process. Also, we, as said before, we have the age dimension that we look at. And surprisingly, we find, or remarkably we find, a huge increase in the share of relatively young workers, which are below 35 years old, for our treatment group. And this is, maybe at a first glance, this differs from aggregate level findings that we have on sector level in the industry, or on industry level, for example, by Dowd and co-authors. They find negative effects on this relatively young group, or that they are not even hired. And this could be a specific feature of the German labor market, which could be connected to for example, the dual apprenticeship program, meaning that this could indicate that especially for the robot adopting firms, the young workers are more complements to robots. But of course, there could also be other stories behind this. Of course, for the other two groups, we see also a significant increase for the relatively middle-aged groups, but in terms of size, it's smaller, the effect, while there's no significant impact on the older group. And also, which is a remarkable feature of our data, is that we can actually look at this occupation age composition, so per cell. And the last result I commented on is, you can see in the first row, the result for young employees in yellow, or highlighted in yellow, seems to be mostly driven actually by the simple manual occupations, which on a first glance also is maybe might be surprising. Nevertheless, we can maybe discuss this later on, but we see when we split this additionally by the age dimension that with respect to each of these occupational groups, we see in some terms differential effects with respect to the age dimension, which we also refer to as the vintage of human capital story. For example, for managers, you could think of profiting from experience and restructuring the process or production process in their career before, leading to a significant increase, especially for the older managers in robot adopting plants. So let me conclude. I think I have 1.5 more minutes. We find overall that employment gains are concentrated among younger workers, among technicians, engineers, and managers, so rather the complements to robots. And with respect to policy implications, this could mean that, again, this is suggestive evidence from our analysis, but that a shortage of younger workers could hinder a large-scale robot adoption in the future. And at the same time, that it could also mean that the demand for relatively low or middle-skilled older workers is going to decline. And to conclude overall, particularly interesting is that we can show with our micro-level data this reallocative effects that are in favor of robot adopters, and robot adopters seem to compete with the non-adopters for these young employees especially. Thank you very much.
So I uploaded the slides just maybe about 20 minutes ago. Maybe we can bring them on the screen. There you are. All right. So, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to discuss this paper. Delighted to be here. So just a high-level thoughts before I get into the discussion a little bit more. I'm going to say, first of all, this is a very nice addition to the robot literature. This is a growing literature. I think Verena and Stefan said it exactly right. There's a lot of new papers coming out now with microdata, and this is one of them. They mentioned this is not showing causality. That's correct, and one of my comments is directed to that. But I'm going to say it's not showing causality yet. I know they have plans, and there's things that they can do to really make this paper be a really important contribution. Stefan undersold the paper a bit. I think there are two very nice contributions in this paper already. There's not much that we know about the impact of robot adoption on the different types of workers. And this paper is the first that I've seen that really digs into this question with some level of granularity. They are extending the models that are out there in the literature to incorporate both the comparative advantage that comes with these occupations, with these tasks, with age. And the idea and the insight is very clear. Within very specific occupations, there's going to be heterogeneity, and that heterogeneity is going to be driven by the age of the individual. And so you can be a relatively low-skilled manual worker, but if you're young, you've been much more exposed to technology, and you're a lot better than your parents are at using technology. And so that's going to come through in the results that they're going to show us. So I'm going to say super interesting in terms of some of the findings, somewhat unexpected, but I think once you think about it, it's actually quite intuitive. And I'll push them a little bit more, or a little bit, I'll say, to tell us more about who these individuals are, what exactly they're doing. They have a lot of detailed occupation data, so they can tell us a little bit about that. But before I get there. They use very detailed plant and worker level data. The data exercise is quite impressive. They do an event study specification with plant fixed effects. They look at not only employment, but also hires and separations. So they have those sources of variation. Sorry, my computer is doing weird things. Now I'm going to say currently the paper is estimating average plant effects, which is great. And I'm going to push them to tell us more. There's lots more that they can do to tell us what's happening in the industry and to workers generally, beyond what's happening to them at what's happening in the average firm. So about the data, again, quite impressive. They're using the IAB establishment survey data, this firm level data, establishment level data, with these retroactive measures of robot use, which they're going to use to identify adopters. They have to they enhance this data with some history information about the employment at these plants, so that they can deal with truncation, some history truncation issues. So that's very nice. They bring in the Social Security data so they can track what workers are doing and their occupation. So a very impressive data effort. Let me recap a little bit of their findings. And I think this is very nice. So, Verena, you focused on it, and I think this is great, right? So older manual workers are more replaceable than young manual workers. And when we're thinking about technology, to me, this makes a lot of sense, although we may not have expected that. Older cognitive, older workers that use cognitive skills, managers, engineers, are less replaceable than younger workers that use cognitive skills. Again, this makes to me a lot of sense. Experience matters. I'm sorry for the young people in the crowd. Experience does matter. So the, you know, at least we have that as we're aging. So what are the kind of key finding? 5 to 6% employment growth relative to controls. Again, this is not causal, but strong effects. No growth for their controls during this time. The results by task relative to controls. So what do they find? Increased hiring of engineers and managers, as well as service workers. Also, qualified manual. Some pre-trends there, and no apparent effects on simple manual on first approach. Right? In that sense, there's a relative decline in the hiring of those workers. The results by age are really interesting, and of course, they're going to go and interact those. There's an increase of young workers, some pre-trends there, increases of middle age, 35 to 54, and declines in the over 55. Or not significant, by the way, I should say, so relative decline. The interaction is where a lot of the interesting results come in, and so there's this growth in the simple manual tasks for young workers. And then growth in middle-aged cognitive occupation or tasks. So very nice in that regard. Their conclusion, in terms of policy, since we're here, Bruegel's, young workers in low middle skill occupations are complements to robots. This is somewhat a little bit different from what Philippe Aguillon shows with the French data, but they just don't have the granularity to look at this question, right? And in fact, he raises the question and he points to, well, maybe there's this within detail occupation effects that we're missing, and you're showing them here. So very nice. Of course, they go on to say if there's a shortage of these types of workers, that could present a little bit of a challenge in terms of adoption of robots. So kind of understanding kind of the role that these young workers, relatively low-skilled young workers play in these firms is interesting. I suspect that it's not a German thing, but we'll see. It's growing literature. And of course, demand for middle-skilled older workers will decline. Benefits from robot adoptions. Okay, so comments. So this is not causal. Pre-trends in some. Thank you. I'm looking at my computer. Sorry. It's like my eyesight is failing me. Thank you. Thank you. So pre-trends. So just there's very simple things that you can do. Just control for prior growth is something that we were told to do by by referees in some of our papers. It's a very simple thing that you can do, and it just absorbs some of that variation. You've mentioned that this is not fully causal. Try instrumental variables. Minimum wage variation in Germany and minimum wage shocks. You can try to exploit to see if there's something there that helps you identify this more cleanly. Exchange rate shocks, and so Philippe Aguillon in their paper with the French data, they use that. Now they use the intensive margin, not the adoption, so it's the intensive, but I think you could use that in your data because you know where these firms are importing from. Maybe, I don't know, but something to think about. A couple of ideas there. I mentioned these are average effects. I would love to see weighted results. So none of the specifications are weighted by the size of the firm. Those are more controls. But for me, at the end of the day, I also want to know what's happening to these workers and employment in the industry, not at the average firm. And those two things are not necessarily the same. There's lots more that I would love to see. Impact on revenues, impact on prices, if you have them, profits, exports, right? We've been talking a lot about exports. Maybe that's a different paper, right? But there's lots more that you can do. On reallocation, there's tons more that you can do, I feel. The hirings and separations, I know the sample sizes are not huge, and so the hirings and separations to me look a little funny. There's significant more hirings than separations. That doesn't line up with the employment effects fully. So I think those might be a little bit noisy, but maybe try reallocation, the sum of hires and separations, and maybe that will give you cleaner results. Also, excess reallocations. You would expect a lot of reorganizing and reallocation. In fact, you tell us. So look, tell us about excess reallocation inside of these plans, but also again economy-wide. Kind of what are the impacts from that? I have just a couple more minutes left. There's lots of results. The results for controls you didn't highlight as much, but there's lots of rich patterns there. There's a lot that's happening in Germany around this time. You might be able to absorb away from some of that by doing industry year effects, and that might help you also clean some of the distracting elements of the results. I've already mentioned the Young manual results, super interesting. I've mentioned this. Tell us more about the specific occupations that these folks are engaged in, that are getting hired. There's training information in the IB, I believe. You could tell us a little bit of what's happening with the training. Verena, you hinted at, there's apprenticeships. This might be a German. Maybe you can extract some information from what's in the IB survey. I mean, you could even merge. You have the worker level data. Maybe you could merge external information about the apprenticeships these individuals take. I know in the US we have this type of data. I don't know if this is available in Germany, but if you have it, one of the apprenticeships that's gaining a lot of traction in Germany is in robot using skills, right? And so that is a specific type of apprenticeship and so maybe you find effects in that regard. And I'm going to stop there. I think I'm almost out of time, if not already. But again, very nice and fun to see. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Eric had a question.
Yes, thank you. I'll try not to mimic parrot what Javi's already said. I really like the paper. I like the fact that you have all this data. I think it's rather unique to be able to put together this granular level of types of robots and types of workers and all at the firm level. Javi talked a lot about the causality, and I'd like to preface with that with, causal effects depend causal given some kind of question you've asked, and I never really heard the question. You said, well, there's policy implications are clear, but also the business implications are clear. One could have to do with the fact, what if you take a manager and you zap the part of their brain that knows about robots? So here you have a manager of a firm that doesn't know about robots, and then you give him the blue pill that now all of a sudden he does know about robots. What happens? So that could be a policy issue, or a business thing. Like, is it, what would have happened to the firm that had robots had they not had it? The other question is, what would happen if a policymaker were to create robots, subsidize robots, make them available for free, tax robots? What then would happen that's different from what you've seen in your data? And they're very different questions. And I think you haven't quite specified between the two. I could imagine, for example, that the firms that in your treatment groups. They're forward-looking firms. They've decided that making a robot makes sense, maybe because they see their demand going up, maybe because they see a new area of products, a niche in the market that none of the old traditional firms have done. And maybe they're just therefore young and dynamic firms, and that's why they're hiring young people. And it might have nothing to do with the robots per se. In general, I'd even think that firms that are growing probably we would have a very skewed distribution of younger versus old workers, just because it's costly to recruit workers. And if you get them young, you have a longer life out of them. So I don't see the direct effect there. So I kind of point to the two things. One is really specify the question you're trying to answer. And once you've done that, you can think about an estimation strategy and an identification strategy to understand what's the what if that you're getting at. I did like your use of the the Baker effect of the timing difference of the event. Maybe matching that with some kind of propensity score matching of the types of firms matched by age and types of markets, maybe some downstream indicators of their potential growth, because that's going to be tied into their adoption decision, I think could help. But start, I would say, by specifying which question are you getting at.
Thank you, Eric. So there are 3 more questions around the table, one by Carlo, one by Maria, and one by Lionel afterwards.
I was just wondering whether you had any estimate on the wage effect of the robot adoption, because in other research we have been doing, we find that there seems to be a very clear difference between the globalization shock and the automation shock, in the sense that the globalization shock for sure has an effect downward effect on wages and pushes workers out of the workforce, while the automation shock might have an effect in increasing the skill premium, but that doesn't necessarily be a positive effect on the distributional consequences in terms of society. So we find that both the Chinese and the globalization and automation shock have an effect in increasing inequalities, but through different effect mediated by the labor markets. I was wondering whether, since you have this very nice data, you could find such a high skill premium for those who benefit from robot adoption.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe probably repeat the question that Eric said towards the end. This is the argument of the age effect and robots, which I think also Javier talked about it. But it's not as obvious to me, so intuitive that is. It might just very well be a cost term, that the robots or any other replacement, the first people you try to replace are the older people. And you're talking really about low skills. On the low skills, it's not obvious to me why the older people are more replaceable than the younger people, other than just cost. Because you're talking about using the robot, you're replacing the skill with the robot. It's not obvious to me why the young people actually would have an advantage here, other than the fact that they're cheaper, which is, I think, what Eric was driving at. So I still don't understand what is the over and above effect that robots bring into this age result.
And to conclude, I have a more general question, maybe, that will make the link with the Destatis paper that we had this morning. And I see a clear connection between the two. One of the reasons is that this is about Germany. And the other reason is that at the end of the day, the manager will, contemplate 2 choices when it comes to replacing automative, repetitive tasks, not cognitive, but repetitive tasks. So either you are going to offshore this repetitive task because you lower the wage, or you will adopt a robot. And at the end of the day, this is what Eric was saying. So it will depend of the relative price of the robot. So if you subsidize the robot, maybe you will offshore less. So is there a way of connecting the 2 type of studies? So the survey that was presented this morning and the survey that you are using, since this is German data, I see here a nice collaboration for a forthcoming paper.
Lionel, I don't know if I can make a last question. I try to make myself visible.
You were not on the list, but please.
I tried, but I was not visible enough. No, just a very brief thing. Whenever I think about robots in Germany, of course, I have in mind the paper by Daut and co-authors that you were also mentioning. And if I remember well, those results, they said, okay, there is the overall effect on employment is essentially zero, but there is a decline in employment in manufacturing, and as far as I remember, they say that's especially true in terms of lower job opportunities for newcomers in the labor market. So I'm wondering to what extent your results are showing a different picture, right? Because what Javier was emphasizing before is the result on these relatively young workers with low skills that would actually be complements and therefore benefit. So I'm not sure whether with your data you can say something more on that type of finding, which is what people have in mind at this point, I guess, right? That we have lower job opportunities for the newcomers in manufacturing. Thank you.
So, Stefan, you have material for a new big project, a new consortium for the next 4 years. So, please.
Okay. Yes, I think I will go back in the opposite order when the questions were asked. So. First of all, about the decline in the manufacturing employment in the literature, most of these findings were on sector level. So there's not necessarily a contradiction of what we find on plant level. We actually see, or we interpret our results as a competition of robot adapters and non-adapters for these specific workforce groups. Also, what is found in the literature is that, yes, manufacturing employment declines and that people move to the service sector. But at the same time, I mean, this is really, the new aspect that we also can bring to the literature by looking at this more disaggregated level. Also, I would like to do a comment on the question why older people might be more replaceable than young people. So the idea here could be that when robots are installed in the plant, that potentially also new tasks arise. So this is also the Archimolo and Restrepo type of model, that there's not only a replacement effect, but also a reinstatement effect, which brings new tasks. And the assumption here would be that in general, or on average, younger workforce is maybe quicker in adapting to completely new tasks that they have not been trained on before. One other aspect regarding the paper this morning and the offshoring, in contrast to robots, so this is a different angle of looking at it. We were talking today about mostly about the task channel. This is also what our model relates to, and this captures a different aspect, the comments. So it's about relative factor prices, as you mentioned, and there is already some micro-level evidence in the literature. So, for example, Fan and co-authors, based on a Chinese micro-level data set, actually find that an increase in relative factor prices in terms of minimum wage actually lead also to higher robot adoption rates. So yes, there is evidence, and this is also connected to your question, Ravi, on minimum wage. So we do not observe in our data the wage information after our robot adoption time period that we actually look at. But the other way around, we do see in another paper that is just in the making, that actually a high exposure to the minimum wage introduction actually leads has heterogeneous effects on the probability of robot adoption. So it basically, the relative factor price channel, we do find some preliminary evidence in favor of it. And at the same time, I would argue, maybe the closest argument, the relative factor price channel is definitely also at work. And unfortunately, we cannot look deeper into this based on the data limitations here. But we do see that it's also some driving forces behind this channel.
Okay, so I could also already cross out a couple of questions. Thank you. Eric asked the fundamental question on what the question is. So the question is, okay, what would happen if there's an exogenous increase in the demand for automation because of price changes of robots? What happens to workforce composition? I think that's kind of the thought experiment that most of the papers follow here. And I mean, Javi made the spoiler already. So in the paper, so we already have an IV approach running, which is based on a similar idea put forward by Gratz and Michael. So we create a replaceability index at the firm level, and we find also using this IV a positive effect on employment. So it works for employment. We are not comfortable enough with this estimate to show it, but if that would be purely a demand story, where there is some positive demand shock to the firm, and so they start hiring workers, they start buying robots, and you have the correlation coming from demand shock, in an IV you would expect to see a small zero or negative employment effect then, if that's the pure story. So I think we are relatively safe that this is not just a demand effect to the individual firm. Wage effects, Carlo, it's the next paper. We will work on that. And we can even do more on this. We also have this AKM worker firm wage effects. We have everything, and we will look at how this relates to each other. Javi, great discussion. Work for the next 2 years. Just a few points. Pre-trends, you say we should control for pre-trends. Yes, we could do, but it's also kind of a dangerous endeavor, right? So you never know whether some of the pre-trends are actually caused by the treatment, so some anticipation effects. So once you control for it, you run into difficulties here. So that's always a tricky thing. Relocation is a good point. So we should show job relocation rates. We should show churning rates. And I don't think that hiring and separation effects that we show have to add up to the employment effect, because these are percentage effects based on very different base levels. So I don't think that they are necessarily contradicting here, but maybe we can talk about this later. We will show more about the specific occupations of the young manual workers that see their labor demand increasing. In particular, we will look at whether this is driven by hiring or separations, for instance, and all this type of stuff. We will definitely have to understand this better to make or to explain the difference to Acemoglu Strepo and to Daudedal to say more about that. Yes, I think I stop here. Thanks a lot for your great questions. I take this as a sign for having an interesting paper, so thanks for that.
So it's time for coffee break. So for those who are attending online, we are resuming at 3:30.